real quick, just to introduce myself, my name is Jackson. I'm the TA for this course, and today I'll be giving you guys a little bit, it's gonna be more of a discussion-based topic today. We're gonna be talking about thinking as a sports coach. Now, this is a topic I've been interested in for some time now to try to understand how people think and then how it's going to affect what we do as a coach. So real quick, just a show of hands, how many of you guys are coaches here, or you had an experience as a coach, a leader in some type of setting, like, you know what I mean? Maybe you played sports growing up, like put a hand up, bro. Okay, so most people here have had some experiences coaching. And just like you guys, I'm a coach as well. I started out as a basketball player. I've been playing for, maybe 15 years now. And currently I'm a coach at the University of Waterloo for the men's basketball team. And I also run my own training business, trying to help basketball athletes reach their full potential. And I say all this to say that I've had some unique experiences coaching that have shaped who I am today. I've learned from coaches who are really good, coaches who maybe aren't so good, and I've taken all the information to try to apply it into how I go about my own coaching. So real quick, before we go deeper, I want you guys to join this QR code. Use your phone. We got an app set up, right? You can go ahead and join that. And the question is, where did you get your coaching knowledge from? And I want you to think about through the rest of this presentation how where you got your coaching knowledge from and what you've learned is going to affect the decisions you take and the things that you do as a coach. Oops, here we go. Hopefully throughout the entire term, you guys have noticed that we've been trying to push you towards evidence-based coaching. We've shown you guys different styles, made you read different articles, and evidence-based coaching is trying to combine the best relevant research, your expertise, and the athlete values into that decision-making process for what you're gonna do with your athletes. And so when we make you guys read articles like the Hamilton-Lavoie stuff or stuff about communication, we want you to try to support some of your own coaching ideals and beliefs with some of the evidence, right? And it's important that we do that because using evidence-based coaching is not only gonna affect the physical aspects of performance, like strength and speed and all that different stuff. It's also gonna affect things like the psychological aspects and the social ones as well, in terms of whether we're building intrinsic motivation, self-esteem, building future leaders. All these things are important when we use evidence-based coaching. And when we're talking about the evidence, we're gonna be talking about using science. And science is really important because it's there to help us root out or expose some of the errors in the way that we think. If we didn't have science, most of the time we'd be under the impression of, seeing is believing, or if I've seen it, it must be true. And this type of naive realism, or the assumption that we see the world exactly as it is something that science is trying to combat. This isn't a bad thing that we see the world like this. It's part of who we are, because humans have cognitive biases or systematic errors in the way that they think. Have any of you guys heard of biases before, cognitive biases? Any? Real quick, okay, cool, right? So a framework to try to understand where these biases come from, we have two systems in our mind. System one is the quick thinking, intuitive system that you make those quick decisions with. And it's important because we do use this system a lot when we're trying to make quick decisions, but it can be prone to make these certain biases or take these heuristics or mental shortcuts to try to arrive at those decisions. And this can be useful when things are predictable and linear, but in life, a lot of the times things are not linear. They're not really predictable, so we can have some errors in the way that we think. This is in contrast to system two, which is more rational, slower thought, if you're thinking fast versus thinking slow. And system two is usually gonna be used in terms of science and math. And most of the time, though, when we're talking about sports and coaching and what you believe in, you're probably going to be using system one. And with system one comes some cognitive biases. Some ones I want to highlight for our discussion today, starting off with confirmation bias, which is our tendency to try to find information that's going to fit in with what we believe in. It's the classic expression of seek and ye shall find. You'll find what you're looking for because you want it to confirm what you believe in. It's going to affect how you search for information. You might go and cherry pick certain things that align with your beliefs. It's going to affect what you recall in your mind. You're not going to recall something that disconfirms what you believe in. And it's also going to affect how you interpret results as well. Why would you interpret it in a way that's not going to align with what you believe in? And that's where confirmation bias gets its rap and gets its name and how it affects us. Another bias to consider is survivorship bias. And this is our tendency to look at these successful stories and overvalue those successful stories versus people who are unsuccessful. So we're going to pay more attention to the people who have made it to the top of the mountain, who have climbed it successfully, versus maybe some of the other people who have not made it. The problem with this, though, is that when we only focus on the people at the top of the mountain, we tend to find ourselves in authority bias as well, where we overvalue the opinion of the authority of those who are at the top, the most powerful, because we've put them there. But at the same time, we kind of forget to look at the same people who have tried similar methods but failed. That's where survivorship bias has an effect on us. Another bias that's really important to consider is availability bias, which is our tendency to think of the information that comes to mind the most readily. We use certain heuristics like the availability heuristic. So if we can remember it, it's probably likely to occur. We're going to make predictions and decisions based off if we can remember it clearly or fast. We also have the recognition heuristic, which is, oh, if I've heard it before, it has to be true. It's going to be likely. These type of things pop up in the news, for example, where if you've seen it in the news or you've been hearing about crime, for example, in a certain area, you're going to think, well, that's probably more likely in that area, but it could be just a factor of whether you remember it clearly or not. Another effect that we can have based off the availability bias is the anchor effect, where we remember the first piece of information. We're tied to that. If I asked you to guess how tall on average or how tall is the tallest tree in some rainforest, if I told you 3,000, you're going to guess around there. But if I told you 20,000, you guess somewhere else. You're anchored to that first piece of information that easily comes to mind. Another bias we have to be aware of is hindsight bias. It's the I told you so bias. I knew it all along bias. That tends to pop up in the way we think. It's our tendency to think of events as more predictable after they've occurred. And this kind of lends into our story bias as well, where we like to try to fit details into a nice narrative. We like good stories. Another bias that we have to be aware of is fundamental attribution error, which is our tendency to try to place blame when we're talking about other people's actions on the internal factors versus the external context. So imagine you're driving in a car and you swerve and you cut someone off. Well, it's not really my fault. I'm just late for work. But if someone cuts you off, well, that person is a bad driver. They're a piece of, you can go on and on and on. And that's our fundamental attribution error. Another bias we got to take note of is illusory correlation, which is our tendency to try to find patterns and connections between things that may not necessarily exist. So for example, in June, ice cream sales go up. Also in June, crime goes up. And these things might go up equally together, and you might try to draw that correlation of, hey, ice cream sales cause more crime. But obviously this isn't true. We have a confounding variable, which is the summer. And so our tendency to try to find these false correlation between things also pops up in the way we think. I brought all this up to not try to bash the way that we're thinking or anything like that. I just want to highlight some of the things that pop up in our thinking, in our system one, because of what we've been exposed to in our culture. Humans, we rely on our intuitions much more than we rely on science, per se. Science is abstract, far away, objective, whereas our biases are close and personal to us, and we're going to believe those more readily. But the problem with that, though, is that we don't want to let that influence our decision-making all the time. And that's what we've been trying to expose you to throughout this course. Real quick, I wanted to ask you guys a question. You just answer in your head. You don't have to put up your hand for this one. How do you become an expert at a sport? Think about that for a second. How do you become an expert at a sport? How do you help someone become an expert at their sport, to become a pro? Cool. Just for some context, y'all know who Kyrie is, right? We've heard of Kyrie Irving, famous basketball player, very good basketball player at that. And like he's talking about, right, the dominant approach to make someone an expert would be kind of two things. You practice a lot, you practice deliberately, and you specialize early. You focus on one particular sport. Now, deliberate practice can be understood as high quality, high concentration practice that maybe isn't enjoyable all the time, but it's designed to improve performance. And like Kyrie's talking about, doing high amounts of deliberate practice, maybe if you wanted to start a little earlier, if you're 8 years old, you practice 20 hours a week, 4 hours a day, give or take, Over time, you'll become an expert, you specialize, cut out all the other stuff, focus just on basketball. You might become an expert and you'll probably get better at your sport. And if you listen to success stories of how we should become an expert, like for example with Serena Williams, who started tennis at the age of 4, the GOAT, right? You'll see some positive effects of starting early and playing a lot of your sport, deliberately practicing for a lot of time. And that's probably the first thing that popped into your head when I asked you, how do you become an expert? You practice and you start early. You go after it. When we try to look a little bit deeper, though, in the way that we think about answering that question, and we go back to some of the original studies that have looked at this stuff. Originally, they looked at violin and chess players and tried to find how much hours they spent to become the expert at what they do. And the problem was, though, the amount of time that they spent practicing, the amount of hours they spent practicing, there was a lot of variability. It ranged from maybe 4,000, 8,000, 20,000. Trying to find a particular number that represents how much time it takes to become an expert is problematic because there's so much individual variation in how long it takes to become an expert. When we look at an overemphasis on deliberate practice and forcing people to specialize early, we can also see some problems like burnout, where you feel like, I don't want to do this anymore, you lose that motivation. You can have poor psychosocial outcomes. Maybe you're having problems with self-esteem, or you're not developing some of the leadership qualities that might be required in later life. You might run into overuse injuries by stressing those same tissues over and over again because you've been practicing for so hard for so long. And you might end up with problems with attrition, where you don't even want to do sport anymore, or you drop out of physical activity entirely. And so when we take a deeper look, of course, early specialization is a pathway to elite performance. You can start and focus on deliberate practice from a young age, but there's problems with that. And it doesn't necessarily take into account other people who haven't done that, like some who are late bloomers who start very late in how they can become an expert, or those who have spent a lot of time playing multiple sports growing up, or focus more on playing different activities and doing different things before they became an expert. So real quick, when we think about the 10,000 hour rule, maybe something that, did that pop into anyone's mind when you've heard of that before, 10,000 hour rule? This idea of the 10,000 hour rule, this amount of time it takes to become an expert, 10,000 hours, 10 years, whatever have you. This idea is so rooted in our mind, yet I'm telling you right now that there's evidence not in support of it. But this rule somewhere exists inside of our brain somewhere. We're biased to believe in it. And so I want to take some time now. You guys you don't have to join the QR code. Just talk amongst your pair if you have one, or you can think by yourself, whatever have you. I'm going to give you some time. I want you to think about what biases and heuristics have influenced the idea of the 10,000 hour rule. You guys good here? Yeah. Cool. Thinking about it? You want a partner? Or?
Nah, I was talking about that.
Okay. Real quick, Gag, like from your groups, let's talk. Talk to me. Right? He brings up a great point. Like when we have people who are successful athletes, and you ask a successful athlete, how long did it take? Oh, man, it took me 10,000 hours. I've been doing this. I've been practicing. Right? That idea gets propagated throughout the entire community of sports because we look at those experts as the word, as the rule. Right, absolutely, right. I talked about the variability amongst people, but like 10,000 hours is like, that's a good number. Even number, lots of zeros, sounds great, right? It fits into the type of narrative that we might try to push on people because it sounds good, for sure. Like, you know what I mean? Like if you go online, you look, like those are, these books are super popular. I don't know if you guys have ever read these books. These books are super popular. And like, this is not just in sport. This is in other aspects of like business, becoming a leader, all this stuff. So if you look up how long does it take to become an expert, they'll tell you, you got to work hard. You got to put in the effort. You got to put 10,000 hours in. And so the availability of that information, it comes to mind first. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I heard of that before, right? We start to use those heuristics. That availability bias kicks in. I saw another hand right here, yeah. I think it plays into too with the survivorship bias as well, because we're not going to hear about the failures. Right? The failures don't come to mind as easily as the success stories do. I didn't talk about this one. We have an affect bias, a tendency to put emotional labels on things, like things we care about, positive experiences we care more about. versus a negative effect. So that plays into that as well. Any other ideas we had? What about confirmation bias? Any ideas for that bias? 100%. You touched on a great point too. Like we're going to talk about this a little bit later. Like siloed thinking, when you're embedded in a culture that continually talks about this message, that's all you see. That's all that's going to confirm your belief. You're not going to go seek out information that's not going to confirm it. Why would you try to find an athlete who's not putting 10,000 hours? Why would you do that? Right? There's no reason to. You have the information that you need right at your fingertips, right? You look for it, you found it. That's confirmation bias. What about someone who doesn't have 10,000 hours? What would you say? Or they do the 10,000 hours and it doesn't work. How could fundamental attribution error affect that? Great point. Let's hold on to that. What about the reverse too? What about not if you failed, but if someone else fails and they don't get what would you say about that? Exactly, right? So that fundamental attribution, where if we don't succeed, man, it's not really our fault. Like I didn't have whatever, blah, blah, blah. And if someone else doesn't succeed, we're gonna put it on them, man. Those guys are lazy. They didn't put in the 10,000. That 10,000 hours, it wasn't the right type of hours. You didn't do it right. Right? These type of biases pop up in the way we think. But all right, I won't belabor this point about 10,000 hours. I want to talk about you guys right now. I want to talk about you. So get into a reflective mode about who you are and what you do as a coach. Because I'm asking you guys right now is, who are you as a coach? Like, who are you? Don't answer that. You don't have to answer that, right? But hopefully when I ask that question, what's coming to mind is something related to like your coaching philosophy. Right? We started with that at the very start of the year. Like, who are you as a coach? What do you believe in? Because it's going to affect your style as a coach, what type of leadership you go about things, and what methods you use to achieve success as a coach. And talking about this stuff is important because how do you know whether your coaching style is right? How do you know who's a good coach? What the best style is? These are difficult questions to answer, but they can be biased by our ways of thinking. So for example, our selection of a coaching philosophy is going to be affected by our biases. Survivorship bias is going to cause us to look at the best coaches. Now, there's nothing wrong with looking at the best coaches. They were the best for a reason, obviously, but we tend to overvalue some of what they do. So for example, like John Wooden, you hear the John Wooden pyramid, not to say his methods are wrong, but sometimes people take some of his methods and forget the context of where he was when he used them, what his team was like at that time period, right? And then similarly, we're not going to look at other coaches. Maybe someone has an updated method or a different way of approaching things. We're not going to care about that because, well, they weren't the best, right? But there are still people who have used maybe your favorite coach's methods but not succeeded. And that's our bias in that way. We also are affected by availability bias, right? Our tendency to look at information that comes to mind more readily. You know, if I tell you, if you see a coach that pops up in the news and they look all fancy, and then you go and say, oh, who's a good coach? Well, no, it's them, right? I remember them. It makes sense, right? This type of availability bias, like we're going to be more biased to look at things that come to mind. And that happens in research too here at our school, right? We tell you about certain coaches, and when you go ahead and look at things later on, you're going to remember what we've told you, what comes to mind first, but maybe not some other things that could be useful. That's our availability bias. Now, justification of our coaching methodology is also going to be affected by our biases. I want you guys to take a second. We're going to join that QR code again. I'm going to open it up real quick. I want you to think about if you were a coach-centered style of coach. Real quick, who can remind me what that was? Like y'all, real fast. Coach-centered, we remember that? Yeah. Exactly, right? You know, do as I say is my team. Imagine you're that type of coach. Not that that's a wrong style, but imagine that you are that style. And how would your biases affect your justification of what you do, your methods, your style? How would that affect how you describe or talk about someone who does well under your coaching style, someone who does poor with your coaching style, and someone who succeeds under another coach with a different style, maybe a transformative style? What would you say about that person? So real quick, join that QR code. You can think about the biases again. I got them on the board. And just think about how you would justify some of those certain things. You can answer one of them, all of them, two of them, whatever you want. Go ahead. Feel free to talk to each other too. Y'all could talk. You don't got to be quiet. Talk to your friend. Like, you don't got to whisper. You could talk normally. Think about this, right? This is complex. Not easy. So attribution error. Right? Exactly, right? Our biases are going to shape how we justify our methods. I'm not gonna look for information that doesn't confirm with what I believe in. Why would I? Right? And if they don't do well, I'm gonna just blame it on them. It's not my fault. It's not my fault. I did my job. It's their fault. They didn't fit into my system. Right? And these type of ideas are really important to understand, because when you talk about your own philosophy too, are you justifying it because you're biased, or are you actually objectively looking at some of the information? This is really important to consider. I like that part about not doing well in hindsight bias, right? We remember, I told you we have a bias to try to form information into a nice predictable story afterwards, after we've seen it all. So when the person doesn't do well under our style, oh man, I knew it all along. They wasn't gonna work. It wasn't me, I knew it. But you really didn't know it at the start, right? But our bias to try to fit that information to a nice narrative leads us to think that. And so we continue to justify our methods because, oh no, I was able to predict that they weren't gonna do well. It's fine. I saw it. I saw it coming, right? That plays into that as well. A coach, maybe someone we admire as a coach, right? Maybe it's a coach you had when you grew up, who you learned from. If your style, you copied a similar style as them, you're gonna believe that it's gonna work. You probably picked that style because you were biased to believe in that coach and to believe in that certain style, right? And that's really something important to consider. And why did you select your coaching philosophy? Was it because you thought about some of the evidence behind that, or is it because you just love the success stories? I want you guys to, let's say, hold on, let me go back to the slide real quick. Let's talk maybe, I didn't see any about maybe like illusory correlation. How do you think illusory correlation would play into how you see successes or someone doing poorly? Were you about to answer? My friend right here? You have an idea? I thought I saw him. Okay. How would illusory correlation play into some of that narrative you play as well? Let's think about that for a second. Absolutely. Right? Now, coaches are very important. They have the ability to affect the climate, the culture, a lot of what goes on. But that doesn't mean necessarily that what the coach does is what's causing the effects on the team. You might have a successful team with a coach who's not doing things that build success based off of what we understand, but yet we'll say, nah, it was the coach that did it. And so we have to think about that as well in terms of what we do as a coach. Are we actually making an impact on our team in the way that we think we are, or are we just seeing something else correlating and trying to find a pattern with that? That's something to think about as well. Now, I know we've talked so far about how our biases can pop up into like culture and how we make decisions as a coach. And we've also talked about how our biases can pop up in how you think as a coach and how you decide on a philosophy, your style of coaching. And bringing this up is really important because throughout the entirety of the course, we've been trying to expose you guys to some different evidence-based ideas to aid you in your coaching journey. And this is important because we're trying to ultimately avoid path dependency. Has anyone heard of that term before? No? Yes? You've heard of it before? Nice, right? I was hoping this would be like kind of a new term for everyone because I wanted to, it's kind of interesting to me. Anyways, path dependency is how our current experiences or beliefs have been shaped by the past. We're ultimately trying to answer the question of what decisions did we make to get here? Now, when we think about path dependency, it's really important to consider because the decisions we made in the past have persisted even today, despite the context and the circumstances no longer being relevant. This is very important. The context and the situations have changed, but yet the decision and what we've seen as the outcome remain. Now, I want you to take a look at your keyboard. Real quick, take a look at your keyboard. You see how the keys are arranged? Why are the keys arranged like that? Why are the keys arranged like that? Why are they like that? I mean, it's all. I think what I'm really trying to get at is what your first answer was I don't know. When I had I don't know why the keys are really like that. Like, I mean, it's always how the keys have been. We've been had the keys like that. What's the problem with that, right? And you brought up a great point about the typewriter. The reason why the keys are arranged like that is because the typewriters used to jam if you typed on them too fast. So they had to arrange the keys in a way where some of the common keys were more split apart so you don't end up jamming the keys. So for example, you put the A under the pinky finger because it's not as strong, right? You might not be using that finger as much or using it as strongly as other fingers. But your keyboard doesn't jam, right? Hopefully not, right? So we can see that there's path dependency here because even though the circumstances of the jamming keys have changed, or were present in the past, the circumstances have changed today. We don't have to worry about that anymore, but the arrangement of the keys is still there. It's how we've always done it. And so we keep doing it. There's no other arrangement we're going to prefer to. We're not going to arrange it in common words or closer keys together. None of those ideas have taken shape because there's path dependence. And we have to understand that path dependence creates this ideological inertia where new ideas are harder to take shape, harder to take root in how we think. At the beginning, we start off with multiple avenues, multiple pathways, but over time, different constraints from society, politics, economics, the list goes on, they shape our decisions and we end up in one path. When we talk about this in sports, when we think about this in sports now, this uncritical inertia in sports is fueled by our biases and what we've experienced from a social cultural context. When I asked you to think about maybe why you coached or really the hidden reason why you do a certain thing in coaching or why you believe in 10,000 hours, well, it's probably because it's how we've always done it. It's what I believed in, right? But this type of thinking can lead us to doing the same things over and over again and only looking for confirmation of what we believe in. And so new ideas in coaching, different things of different communication style. We talked about transformational leadership. You guys had a presentation about that. Was that last week? Week before, right? Even though you can see some benefits from this style of leadership, the coach-centered style, or even closer to, or maybe leaning towards more of the athlete-centered coach, that style is still so prevalent because that's how it's always been done. That's how I was coached. That's how maybe you were coached. That's how probably you're going to end up coaching in some fashion or some way because that's path dependency. Why would you change it if we've done it that way for so long? The problem with that, though, is that we never see new ideas taking shape and we never see anything new being done in coaching. Now, real quick, I mean, if you think for a second, maybe you're thinking like, nah, well, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of biased, but like, I'm not that bad of a coach. Like, I think of new ideas. I do new things. Like, you can also be a part of the club because we also have a biased blind spot as well, where we tend to observe biases better in other people, but not so much in ourselves. And this is kind of related to the Dunning-Kruger effect, where even with low levels of competence, low levels of knowledge, we think that we're really confident in what we know. We have this illusion of knowledge where we think that we know much more about a topic than we actually do. And so when we're thinking about our biases and thinking about how we coach, we tend to feel like, oh, no, I know this stuff already. I know that I'm not doing the same thing. I thought about this, but sometimes we really haven't, and that's something important to consider, even for myself. Even though I'm presenting on this topic today, I can still fall victim to this. But all right, let's take a step back for a second. And today we're talking about how to think as a sports coach. I want to talk about how to think differently as a sports coach, because maybe you feel like, well, okay, I might be a little bit biased and these things have popped up. How do you change that? How do you go forward? What do you have to do now? How do we actually take this information and make something of it? To think differently as a sports coach, you got to be reflective. Now, reflection is going to be the active consideration of any beliefs or values or anything that has influenced you and thinking about how the way that you think. It's going to be important as a coach as you guys go forward to ask yourself simple questions like, what is my practice like? And how did it come to be like this? These type of basic questions are going to try to get at why you do certain things, why these hidden things are in your mind, and try to better your practice and help you move forward as a coach. Importantly, reflective coaches are going to be open-minded. I'm not saying that you guys are, just disregarding everything. You want to keep an open mind, but at the same time, you want to be scrutinous, right? Love all theories, but love some of them. Know all theories, love some, but don't be wedded to just one. You want to try to find different information. You want to be a skeptic in a sense where you're going to keep an open mind and be ready to receive information, but not just receive any information, right? Because reflective coaches are going to be ones who seek out disconfirming ideas. maybe the coaching style that you believe in, or maybe you believe in the 10,000 hours, that's not anything wrong, but you should also seek out different things that have tried to go against that. Not to say that it's truth or what's right or wrong, but you should try to find information that doesn't always align with what your beliefs in, because you can strengthen yourself as a coach by considering different perspectives. When you're doing that, you want to think about whether the information you're receiving is falsifiable. Is there loopholes in that coaching? We talk about those biases, right? It's easy to say, someone doesn't succeed, right? When we have a little bit of a loophole kind of put in, like, let's say, for example, a common expression is, if it gets worse before it gets better, right? Someone might say that, but that's kind of a loophole. If it gets better before it gets worse, that's a good thing. And if it does get worse before it gets better, then it's also good. We just said it, right? You got to look out for some of these loopholes and some of these things that pop up in literature and science and the way people think that might be related to like pseudoscience. Also, when we're thinking about different ideas, you got to think about the underlying assumptions in it. We talked about all these biases, right? Like, where do some of the biases pop up in 10,000 hours? Where did the biases pop up? And when we look at our favorite coach, when we looked at how we grew up, we got to consider all these things as we move forward. Reflective coaches are also going to understand the effects of a siloed approach. I mentioned that a lot earlier on in the presentation. A siloed approach is just like these things. The silos don't touch, right? They don't interact. So if you're a coach and you're only considering one perspective, or you're working in one silo, it's going to be difficult to try to get varying and differing perspectives on the way that you're thinking. You want to try to have an integration of multiple disciplines of research, whether that's psychology, physiology, nutrition. You want to combine all these different things to try to inform why you do things. Related to that, we also have to be wary of an over-reliance on anecdotes. We all love anecdotes as a coach, right? Good stories, talking to whoever is probably where you got most of your coaching knowledge from, just observing and having conversations and whatever have you with your athletes. But the problem with anecdotes is that sometimes they're difficult to verify, and they can be prone to have certain biases in them that make us believe in them more. Like I said, like a story bias. Someone tells you a good story of, yo, man, I did this with my player. They sucked, and all of a sudden, boom, man, it's a star. I told you, right? We tend to believe those anecdotes more readily, but there's a lot of biases that are hidden in underneath those stories. And so, real quick, let's join again. I want you guys to take some time, reflect on maybe a story that you had. Oh, I got to open it, hold on. Reflect on maybe a story that you have about how maybe your biases popped up and how you coach. Give an example of how biases can pop up, maybe something beyond what we said, a takeaway you have from this lecture, any questions you have for me. This is kind of our wrap-up discussion period. Like, feel free to just kind of go on anything you want. And if you don't have anything to say, that's cool as well. But maybe just internally take some time to reflect on what you believe in as well. If you have something, you can put it up there. I can give an example as we wait. Like, one thing I had to think about when the way that I'm coaching a lot is kind of my availability bias and my survivorship bias, because the way that I grew up, right, as I became like successful, I used certain ways to get successful. And there's no doubt in my mind that those ways worked. But then I had to really think about, like, am I doing this just because it's been done before, because I trust those coaches? Is what they're doing actually supported by evidence? Like, that's how my survivorship bias and my availability bias kind of played into what I used to do as a coach and how I've transformed a little bit now. So maybe you have like a similar experiences, right? I have a great reflection here. Biases are everywhere and you're unable to avoid them, but being aware of your own biases can improve your coaching. Absolutely, brilliantly said. Does anyone want to own up to that? Who said that? Who said that? You said that? That's beautiful. Thank you for saying that. Because that's ultimately like the main part of this. Like, we're all going to be biased in some way. It happens, right? We have these cognitive errors in our thinking. Like, there's so many more I could have talked. Like, I think there's over at least 100 of them that have been like identified, like systematically through research. There's a lot more, right? But I don't want you to feel like, oh, this is like a daunting task, or anything like that. It's just about being aware of them, reflecting on how they pop up. There's no reason you have to discard your own coaching philosophy, but being aware of the biases that are underneath that can help strengthen you as a coach as you try to use evidence in your coaching. One thing I do want to touch on, though, with that is that I don't want you to feel like anything we've told you throughout the entire course is the right way to coach. You know what I mean? I think I'm just going to agree with it. Like, there's no exactly right way to coach. There might be better ways, more ways that are supported by evidence, more ways that are, contextually sensitive to the time that we are now. but you have to think about that type of stuff, right? There's no reason why you can't do what was done in the past. Like I said, I brought up John Wooden as an example of survivorship bias, but also John Wooden is a great example of someone whose theories have been adopted to now contextually relevant stuff. Some of his pyramid of needs and things like that. Those things are still relevant today, right? So you do want to take information from different coaches, different styles, and put that into your own coaching, understanding some of the biases and assumptions that go into that as well. Absolutely, right? I didn't get to touch on it so much today, but when we're talking about confirmation bias, right? A good way to avoid that is using multiple methods, multiple, what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe multiple sources of information, right? You don't want to just rely on your own eye test, right? Remember I said seeing is believing. That's part of our naive realism. You want to try to find objective measures too. How are they looking not just on the court, on the field, but off the court? Other measures that will try to influence the way that you believe what you're doing is right. I have a question here. Wouldn't being a reflective coach who tries to find loopholes is also being susceptible to their own biases about what they believe? Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great question, right? Being a reflective coach, though, is not just like a one-time done thing. It's a continuous process. I'm not saying if you realize you have biases, like, okay, shoot, like I'm done with that style. That's not the point, right? The point is kind of that reflection we had at the very start about being aware of those biases, right? This is a never-ending process. As you continue to think about the way that you're thinking, like metacognition, you'll try to update your theories. You'll keep updating yourself. You keep changing as a coach. It's not a one-time done process, but that is something definitely to consider. Sometimes when we go about our own like coaching, like we might try to place blame on the individual without considering sometimes the context. That's something to reflect on as a coach and when you're trying to explain things as well. Like, are you falling victim to that fundamental attribution error? Like perhaps maybe the method that you chose, maybe it wasn't sensitive to that context, right? Maybe the players were different. These are some of the complex issues that can pop up inside of sports. Like when I talk about path dependency, like that stuff is there. The keyboard is there, right? You're not going to go out and change the keyboard. You're not going to do that, right? There's a lot of different things that factor into that. It's just like how you're not going to change the coaching game right away. But slowly over time, when you start to question things, when you start to think about things, you start to make cracks inside of that system. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, but that's kind of what I'm seeing down here, at the top as well. You should never think you're done learning about how to be a coach, right? Like I said, it's a continuous process. It's not gonna stop at one point, right? Breaking path dependency, breaking what's been done before, you never know what's gonna be the catalyst to push that forward. Just like what we never knew what the decision was to make that thing in the first place. So all that gets tied together. And real quick, I like this last one. The way that our coaches are trained, or new coaches and instructors, is heavily influenced on how the older coaches were trained or what worked, right? That's honestly the essence of how path dependency works. Like you go ahead, and we've been experiencing training here. Like this institution is great because we're exposing you guys to multiple sources. Like you go out and you read articles, you go out and you go into the field, you reflect on, you put it to a standard. Like, okay, the coach was using this style. Like this is great, right? But a lot of times in like a different setting, you're going to go to a coaching clinic and they're going to tell you what's worked before. They're going to tell you what the national team coach did, what was successful, and what they did was probably built on what they did in the past and how successful they were. And so that's where that cycle keeps going on and on and on and on about. And that's why it's important for you to consider, like when I asked you at the very start, where do you get your coaching knowledge from, right? You've been fortunate enough here to get some formal education in terms of going out and researching articles, but not everyone gets that. A lot of what coaches learn from, we've seen through research, is through informal situations, conversations, observation. But with that comes those biases as well. So that's important to think about. So real quick, guys, like thank you for having me today. Hopefully you've had some opportunity to reflect on how you think as a coach, why you do certain things, why things have always been done that way. And like I said, going forward, like it's not an end process. This is something continuously to go on about, and it's all about just thinking about the way that you think, right? These biases are real; they're a part of us, but that's not a limitation. That's something you could use to your strength as you go forward as a coach. So thank you, appreciate it.